She typed in all caps. Not just emphasized it. Not casually mentioned it. She made sure the entire basketball world saw it. Exact. That was the word. Sophie Cunningham jumped onto social media and declared that the final play against Washington was the exact play drawn up by the coaching staff, and that the Indiana Fever executed it perfectly. The second I saw that post, I knew one thing. This story was not ending anytime soon. Welcome back to Street Hoops. I'm Dre Fiber, and today we're diving into one of the most talked about storylines in the WNBA right now. Because what started as a game-winning shot has evolved into something much bigger. A debate about coaching, player freedom, team messaging, and the public reaction that followed. Let's rewind for a second. Monday night, Fever versus Mystics. The game is hanging by a thread. Then Caitlin Clark launches a deep three with barely any time remaining. The shot drops. Indiana wins. The crowd erupts. Social media explodes. Highlight shows run the clip on repeat. It instantly becomes one of the defining moments of the season. But the conversation didn't stop with the shot. Almost immediately, fans started dissecting every detail of the final possession. Who was the intended option? Was the play executed exactly as designed? Did players make adjustments in real time? Was the defense responsible for creating the opportunity? Everyone had a theory. Then Sophie Cunningham added fuel to the fire. After the game, she shared content celebrating the moment, and fans began interpreting it as evidence that players had reacted instinctively rather than following a rigid script. Whether those interpretations were accurate or not didn't really matter. The narrative was already spreading. People were talking. Sports media was talking. Basketball podcasts were talking. And social media was definitely talking. Then came the clarification. Cunningham posted that the play was the exact play drawn up by the coaching staff. Not close. Not mostly. Not generally. Exact. And that's when the internet shifted into overdrive, because fans immediately started debating the wording. Some believed she was simply setting the record straight. Others thought the message felt unusually formal. Still others began speculating that the organization wanted to shut down the growing narrative before it became a larger distraction. Now, let's be fair. There's no public evidence proving anyone forced Sophie Cunningham to post anything. There's no confirmation of ultimatums. No proof of behind-the-scenes demands. But what makes this story fascinating isn't what we know. It's what people think they know. Perception drives sports conversations. And the perception among many fans is that the Fever organization wanted to re-establish control of the narrative. Why? Because the alternative narrative was becoming difficult to manage. The alternative narrative suggested that players made a spontaneous adjustment that created the game-winning shot. The alternative narrative suggested that instinct beats structure. The alternative narrative suggested that basketball IQ in the moment mattered more than the original design. Whether that's true or not, it was gaining traction. And organizations rarely enjoy losing control of the conversation. What makes the situation even more interesting is that every new detail seems to generate another round of questions. A social media post becomes a headline. A press conference answer becomes a debate. A celebration becomes a theory. A single word becomes a story. That's where the Fever find themselves right now. Not just managing basketball games, managing narratives. Because every move involving Caitlin Clark exists under microscope, unlike anything the league has experienced before. Every comment gets analyzed. Every substitution gets questioned. Every timeout becomes content. Every interaction becomes evidence for somebody's theory. And that's the reality of having the most talked about player in women's basketball. Which brings us to the bigger picture. The reason this story refuses to disappear isn't really about Sophie Cunningham. It's not even entirely about the final play. It's about trust. Trust between fans and coaches. Trust between players and systems. Trust that the best decisions are being made in the biggest moments. When fans start questioning those things, every event becomes part of a larger narrative. That's why this discussion continues days after the shot. The game ended. The scoreboard is final. The Fever won. Yet people are still talking, still debating, still analyzing. Because for many observers, the final possession became symbolic of larger questions surrounding the team. Questions about offensive philosophy. Questions about leadership. Questions about who truly drives decision-making during critical moments. And right now, nobody seems satisfied with simple answers. Maybe the play was drawn up exactly as described. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe players simply reacted to what the defense gave them. That's basketball. Sometimes the best play on the whiteboard changes the second the ball is inbound. What remains undeniable is that Caitlin Clark hit the shot. Sophie Cunningham delivered the pass. Indiana got the win. And somehow the discussion afterward became almost as dramatic as the game itself. That's where we are now. A game-winning three-pointer has evolved into one of the most dissected moments of the WNBA season. And until the Fever start consistently winning without controversy attached to every result, these conversations aren't going anywhere. This is Street Hoops. I'm Dre Fiber. And the story is far from over. And Sophie Cunningham, like any professional athlete navigating a competitive league, ultimately did what many players would do in a similar situation. She addressed the conversation publicly, clarified her position, and attempted to put the controversy behind her. But here's what made the response so fascinating. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The word exact became the center of attention. Not because capital letters automatically mean something deeper, but because fans had already spent days debating what really happened on that final possession. By the time Sophie's statement arrived, every word was being examined under a microscope. That's the reality of playing on the most scrutinized team in women's basketball. Every sentence becomes evidence for somebody's theory. Every social media post becomes a puzzle people try to solve. Every clarification creates new questions. And that's exactly what happened here. Some fans read Sophie's statement and accepted it immediately. The play worked. The execution was perfect. End of story. Others weren't convinced. They pointed to earlier comments made after the game, particularly remarks suggesting the team had been looking for different options on the possession. They pointed to interviews discussing reads, reactions, and adjustments. They pointed to comments from teammates that seemed to leave room for interpretation. And suddenly the debate wasn't really about one pass or one shot anymore. It became a discussion about trust, about communication, about who deserves credit, about what actually happens inside those final timeout huddles. Because basketball is rarely as simple as a diagram on a whiteboard. Coaches design actions. Defenses react. Players make reads. The best teams often succeed because players recognize opportunities in real time and capitalize on them. That's not controversy. That's basketball. Yet this particular situation landed differently because it arrived in the middle of several other storylines already surrounding the Indiana Fever organization. Questions about coaching decisions. Questions about player rotations. Questions about media relationships. Questions about internal messaging. Individually, each issue might not attract enormous attention. Together, they create an environment where every new development feels connected to a larger narrative. Whether that narrative is accurate or not becomes almost secondary. The perception itself becomes a story. And perception is something the Fever have been dealing with all season. Every decision is analyzed. Every comment becomes a headline. Every interaction involving Caitlin Clark generates national discussion. That's simply the reality of having the most recognizable player in the sport. Clark's presence changes everything. The spotlight is bigger. The audience is larger. The expectations are higher. And because of that, ordinary organizational decisions often become extraordinary public debates. That's why conversations involving reporters, player comments, coaching decisions, and social media activity all seem to grow into something much larger than they would for most teams. The microscope never turns off. Now let's shift gears for a moment because while much of the discussion has focused on controversy, there's another part of the story that deserves equal attention. The numbers. Because regardless of where anyone stands on the coaching debates, the media debates, or the social media debates, one reality continues becoming impossible to ignore. People are watching in massive numbers. The recent matchup between Indiana and New York produced television ratings that immediately grabbed attention across the sports world. Millions of viewers tuned in. Millions. For a regular season WNBA game. Not a championship. Not a playoff elimination game. Not a special exhibition event. A regular season matchup in June. That fact alone tells you how dramatically the league's visibility has changed. For years, people debated how to expand the audience. For years, executives searched for ways to generate mainstream attention. For years, the conversation centered around growth potential. Now those conversations are being replaced by measurable results. The audience is showing up. The ratings are arriving. The interest is real. And whether people love her, criticize her, support her, or question the attention she receives, Caitlin Clark remains at the center of that phenomenon. The evidence is becoming overwhelming. Attendance rises. Television audiences grow. Social engagement explodes. Merchandise moves. National sports programs discuss the league regularly. The impact extends far beyond one player. But it is impossible to discuss the current boom without acknowledging her role in it. That doesn't diminish the contributions of other stars. It doesn't take anything away from veteran players who helped build the league. It simply recognizes what the numbers continue showing. The audience follows stories. And right now, Clark is one of the biggest stories in sports. That's why every Fever game feels larger than life. A game-winning shot becomes national news. A social media post becomes a debate topic. A coaching decision becomes a week-long discussion. Because the audience isn't just watching basketball anymore. They're following a narrative. They're following personalities. They're following a team that seems to generate headlines every time it steps onto the court. And that's what makes this moment so unique. On one side, you have debates about strategy, coaching, and organizational dynamics. On the other, you have record-setting audiences and unprecedented visibility. Both things are happening simultaneously. The drama fuels attention. The attention fuels discussion. The discussion fuels even more interest. It's a cycle that continues growing with every passing week. And whether you view that as exciting, exhausting, or somewhere in between, there's no denying what we're witnessing. Women's basketball is commanding attention at levels that would have seemed unimaginable not long ago. The ratings prove it. The crowds prove it. The conversation proves it. And at the center of that conversation sits the Indiana Fever, a team that somehow manages to create headlines whether they win, lose, celebrate, clarify, or simply post a tweet. That's where we are right now. A franchise under constant scrutiny, a league experiencing historic growth, and a spotlight that only seems to get brighter with every game. Because the story is no longer just about one shot. It's about everything that shot revealed afterward. And that's what makes the television numbers so remarkable. We're not talking about a playoff showdown. We're not talking about a championship game. We're not even talking about a specially promoted rivalry event. We're talking about a regular season WNBA game played in June that delivered audience figures most sports properties would gladly celebrate. The Indiana Fever versus the New York Liberty averaged approximately 56 million viewers in prime time, producing one of the largest television audiences the league has seen in modern history. Think about that for a moment. A regular season game in June, pulling numbers that place it among the most watched WNBA broadcasts of the last quarter century. That doesn't happen by accident, and it certainly doesn't happen without star power. What's especially interesting is the comparison many observers immediately pointed out. A previous Fever appearance in a similar national television window generated significantly lower viewership when Caitlin Clark was unavailable due to injury. The difference wasn't small. It was substantial. That comparison immediately reignited a conversation that has followed Clark since she entered professional basketball. How much of the league's audience growth is directly connected to her presence? At this point, the debate is becoming increasingly difficult to have with a straight face because the numbers keep pointing in the same direction. Every time Clark appears in a major television showcase, audiences surge. Every time she plays in a nationally televised matchup, ratings outperform expectations. Every time she participates in a high-profile event, interest levels spike. That's not speculation anymore. It's measurable reality. Now, to be fair, the New York Liberty deserve enormous credit as well. They are one of the premier organizations in the league. They feature elite talent. They play in one of the largest media markets in the world. A matchup involving stars like Breanna Stewart is always going to attract attention. The Liberty have earned their place as one of the league's marquee attractions. But what makes these ratings stand out is what happens when Clark enters the equation. The audience expands. The conversation grows. The spotlight intensifies. That's a pattern that keeps repeating. And after multiple seasons of data, it's no longer reasonable to dismiss it as coincidence. The evidence continues stacking higher and higher. Major television audiences, record-setting attendance, explosive social media engagement, merchandise sales, national media coverage. The fingerprints appear everywhere. What once looked like a temporary surge now resembles a fundamental shift in how women's basketball is consumed. Many media analysts have highlighted another remarkable statistic. A large percentage of the most watched WNBA broadcasts in recent years have involved Clark in some capacity, whether it's regular season games, special events, or showcase matchups. Her presence consistently corresponds with extraordinary audience interest. That's not simply popularity. That's influence. And influence extends far beyond the basketball court. This week provided another example. The release of Time's inaugural list recognizing the most influential figures in sports generated considerable attention across the athletic world. Among the names included were global icons whose impact extends beyond their respective games. Athletes whose reach touches culture, business, media, and society. And Caitlin Clark found herself mentioned alongside them. Think about how extraordinary that is. She's still in the early stages of her professional career. Yet her impact is already being discussed in the same broader cultural conversations as some of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. That recognition isn't based on hype alone. It's based on results. It's based on visibility. It's based on measurable influence. And it's based on achievements that continue accumulating at an astonishing pace. Early in the 2026 season, Clark added another historic accomplishment to her growing resume, becoming the fastest player in league history to reach multiple combined scoring, rebounding, and assist milestones. Records continue falling. Benchmarks continue disappearing. And every accomplishment strengthens the argument that we're witnessing one of the most significant careers the sport has ever produced. That's why these conversations feel so important, because they aren't really about a single tweet. They're not truly about one post-game comment. They're not even entirely about one game-winning shot. They're about the intersection of performance, popularity, influence, and expectation. The same player driving record television audiences. The same player setting historic statistical marks. The same player appearing on lists recognizing the most influential athletes in sports. That's the player at the center of every fever discussion. And when someone occupies that position, every surrounding storyline automatically becomes bigger. Every teammate comment receives more scrutiny. Every coaching decision attracts more attention. Every organizational move generates stronger reactions. Whether that's fair or unfair is almost beside the point. It's simply the reality that accompanies unprecedented visibility. The Indiana Fever are no longer operating as just another franchise. They're operating under one of the brightest spotlights in professional sports. And that spotlight exists largely because of the extraordinary attention Caitlin Clark continues to generate. The ratings prove it. The records prove it. The audience proves it. And regardless of where anyone stands on the surrounding controversies, that reality becomes harder to deny with every passing week. Because while debates come and go, numbers tend to tell their own story. And right now, those numbers are telling a story that is impossible to ignore. And that's where this story becomes bigger than one social media post, one injury report, or one controversial comment. Because when people look at everything together, they start seeing a pattern, whether that pattern is real, perceived, or somewhere in between. The discussion is no longer just about Sophie Cunningham. It's about the relationship between star power, team culture, organizational control, and public perception. That's why this conversation refuses to disappear. Every new development seems to connect to a larger narrative already taking shape around the Indiana Fever. A narrative built on questions. Questions about communication. Questions about transparency. Questions about how the organization handles controversy when it appears. And when those questions keep piling up, every small detail suddenly feels much larger than it otherwise would. The Sophie Cunningham situation might not have generated this level of attention by itself. But when people connect it to other stories that have circulated around the franchise, the reaction becomes much stronger. Fans remember previous controversies. They remember disagreements. They remember reports, rumors, interviews, and viral moments. They remember every headline. And before long, a simple tweet becomes another piece of evidence in a case the public has already started building. That's what makes this situation so fascinating. Because at the center of it all stands Caitlin Clark, the most talked about player in women's basketball, but possibly the most influential figure the league has ever produced from a commercial perspective. The numbers supporting that argument continue growing. Television ratings, attendance records, merchandise sales, social engagement, national media coverage. The evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. Clark isn't simply a star player. She's a cultural event. And when someone reaches that level of influence, Every relationship around them becomes a story. Every friendship becomes a headline. Every celebration becomes a talking point. Every interaction gets analyzed frame by frame. That's the reality of operating under a spotlight this bright. What's remarkable is that some of the most memorable Fever moments this season have come from the chemistry between Clark and her teammates. The trust, the communication, the split-second decisions, the instincts that cannot be diagrammed on a whiteboard. Those moments create highlights. They create excitement. They create the kind of basketball that people remember long after the final buzzer sounds. And there are major reasons so many fans have become emotionally invested in this team. That's why reactions become so intense whenever people believe those relationships are being managed, controlled, or limited. Whether those perceptions are completely accurate is almost beside the point. The perception itself has become part of the story. Because fans don't just watch basketball anymore. They follow personalities. They follow connections. They follow the human side of sports. And when they sense tension between authenticity and organizational messaging, they react. Sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, but they react nonetheless. Meanwhile, the numbers continue telling an extraordinary story. Millions of viewers tuning in, historic audiences, record-breaking engagement, recognition from major publications, national conversations extending far beyond the basketball world. Those aren't normal circumstances. Those are signs of a player whose impact extends beyond the court. And that's what makes the Fever situation so unique. You have one of the most marketable athletes in sports. You have a team filled with talented players. You have national attention arriving almost every week. You have opportunities most franchises would dream of having. The challenge becomes figuring out how to maximize all of it while maintaining stability inside the organization. That's easier said than done, especially when every decision is scrutinized, every comment is amplified, and every mistake becomes national news. But the reality remains unchanged. The Indiana Fever are one of the most watched teams in professional basketball. Not just women's basketball, professional basketball. People care about what happens to this team. People care about the players. People care about the story. And stories like the Sophie Cunningham debate only attract even more attention. Whether that's beneficial or damaging depends on how the organization responds moving forward. Because ultimately, fans don't just want victories. They want authenticity. They want transparency. They want to believe the people on the court are being allowed to succeed together. That's what resonates. That's what creates loyalty. That's what turns casual viewers into dedicated supporters. And right now, the Fever have an opportunity few organizations ever receive. They have a superstar capable of drawing massive audiences. They have teammates who have become recognizable personalities in their own right. They have a brand that commands national attention. The question isn't whether the attention exists. The question is how effectively they'll use it. Because opportunities like this don't come around often. The ratings prove it. The headlines prove it. The audience proves it. And every week, the spotlight grows a little brighter. So as this conversation continues, one thing remains certain. People are watching. They're watching the basketball. They're watching the personalities. They're watching the relationships. And they're watching how the organization handles all of it. That's why every tweet matters. That's why every interview matters. That's why every public moment becomes part of a much larger story. And whether you agree with the speculation or not, the discussion itself shows just how important this team has become to the broader sports landscape. That's where we'll leave it today. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to drop your thoughts below. What do you think about the Sophie Cunningham situation? Are fans reading too much into it? Or is there something more beneath the surface? And what does the future look like for a Fever team that continues generating headlines both on and off the court? This is Street Hoops, and the conversation is only getting started.